This show is strictly for educational purposes. The opinions expressed on the show are personal to the individuals appearing in the show and not those of Thinking Tree Ecoholics Private Limited. The show is not intended to offend or defame any individual, entity, caste, community, race, or religion, or to denigrate any institution, person, living or dead. Listener discretion is strongly advised.
Hello and welcome to Ecoholics Thinking Tree series. Today we have with us very distinguished professor Dr. N.R. Bhanumurthy. He is currently working as a professor at National Institute of Public Finance and Policy in New Delhi. He has been associated previously with Institute of Economic Growth, Delhi. Apart from this, he has worked as a macroeconomist at UNESCAP, and apart from the major organization, he was also a consultant at ILO, International Labour Organization, World Bank, and the Asian Development Bank. So welcome, sir. Welcome to our show.
Thank you, Sana. Thank you.
Though COVID has worsened the situation of the world economy, there are some factors that were underlying for ages and have surfaced in their amplified form during this pandemic. In today's discussion, we will look at the current macroeconomic issues in the Indian economy. Sir, to begin with, IMF stated that Indian economy is going through an economic slowdown, most of which cyclical in nature. However, since the pandemic struck our economy, the slowdown became much deep-rooted. Do you think any structural issues are hiding behind the blurring downswing?
Well, the IMF, assessment of India was slightly dated. Now, if you look at the World Bank a couple of days ago and today, OECD, both have come out with a number which is close to minus 3.5% for the current year. Now, your question regarding the IMF's assessment of Indian economy having a cyclical slowdown, I think there was slightly wrong in that assessment. Some of us have been arguing that the Indian economy is actually facing a slowdown, both cyclical as well as structural nature, in a combination of both short-term and long-term structural slowdown that Indian economy was facing. Now, with the onset of the pandemic, the situation actually worsened. Now we are going to have a kind of a prolonged slowdown for a longer time than what everybody expected in the beginning. In fact, there are many assessments already being made that we might be staring at a very deep recession in the current year, where by definition the recession is defined as a negative growth for 2 consecutive quarters. But in our country this year, we may be facing a negative growth for not just for 2 quarters. We may be facing for at least 3 quarters in the current year. So maybe there may be some kind of a recovery in the last quarter of the current financial year. But otherwise, I think we will be largely going to have a deep recession in the current year. So in that sense, the large part of this slowdown would become a structural kind of a slowdown, or I mean, for at least for maybe 4 to 6 quarters now on.
Yes, sir. Indeed, sir, because if we say cyclical in nature, that is not in our hand because this is a globalization era, so we cannot do much about it. But what are your suggestions, like top 3 suggestions that you can suggest for a structural improvement?
See, when you are having a structural problem, you need to have a structural reforms. Very simple.
Yes.
When you have a cyclical problem, you need to have a counter-cyclical measures.
Yes.
Now, as I told you, that India was been facing a both kind of slowdown in the past 2 years. So for a cyclical problem, we were hoping that there would be a counter-cyclical fiscal policy measures where you would, whenever there is a downturn, the fiscal policy will chip in and create some kind of a provide some kind of a stimulus. So that is what we were hoping for the past couple of years. On the structural side, as I told you, you need to have, if you want to address the structural slowdown, you need to come for measures that will bring in structural reforms. So to that extent, to be fair to the government, the measures that has taken by the government in the recent period, many of them can be categorized as structural reforms. May not be a major structural reforms, but certainly there are structural reforms which should definitely help the economy to overcome the structural slowdown in the medium term to long term. I also want to caution here. Now, you can easily overcome the cyclical slowdown because it's going to be 1 quarter or 2 quarter slowdown. You can come out of that kind of a slowdown. But if it is a structural slowdown, to come out of that kind of a slowdown, it takes a longer time. Because as I said, structural means it's a permanent slowdown. So if you want to overcome that, you need to have structural measures, structural reforms. But at the same time, I want to tell you that the outcome of those reforms will take a longer period to show the results compared to the counter-cyclical measures. So in that context, the recent measures by the government of India, both as part of the Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan and also before, all should help in helping the structural, overcoming the structural slowdown. And I also want to tell you that right now, the overall potential GDP of the country must have come down sharply. When I say potential GDP, it is the permanent component. It is the structural component of the GDP, which would have come down sharply because of various policies that government has taken for the past 2-3 years. So just I want to highlight the demonetization as well as the GST measures, which has actually brought down the potential GDP of this country compared to, we used to talk about 8%, 9%, perhaps we may be somewhere close to 6%. So if at all you want to achieve your target of 5 trillion economy and all those things, there is no other goal other than improving the structural part of the GDP, and by doing that you will also increase the potential GDP of this country. So like the measures like agriculture reforms, the measures like GST, they're all structural kind of reforms. Like for example, IBC, Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. So all these things come under the structural part of the policies. And one thing which generally people don't say under these measures is, unique identity numbers. The JAM Trinity, the Gender, Aadhaar and Mobile Trinity, and the DBT. These are all structural policies which should help, improve the potential GDP of this country.
Yes, indeed. We talk about Indian economy, which was facing demand deficiency prior to COVID-19 outbreak, plunged further with the lockdowns, successive lockdowns. The present exercise represent the current problem as a typical demand constraint Keynesian equilibrium. Increased further by demand and supply failures generated by transaction cost. The resulting scenario resembles a supply constraint Keynesian equilibrium. As an economist, what is your take on that?
See, I think we have moved from, whether it's a supply constraint or a demand constraint, it depends on the situation.
Yes.
Now, given, we keep talking about demographic dividend and all those things. Now, the one big character of the Indian economy was, as the Prime Minister also keeps saying, that we have demand. I think that is the general impression about the Indian economy, and that's one of the reasons why there are a lot of foreign investments happening in the country, or the many foreign companies also look at India as a place for demand. But unfortunately, as I said, it depends on the situation. Right now, as you very rightly pointed out, right now the Indian economy is actually facing a typical classic Keynesian demand constraint, especially due to the lockdown, especially due to disturbance in the job market, and because of various other reasons, we are facing a very clear demand constrained economy at the moment. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of economists, including me, have been arguing that there is a need for a large fiscal stimulus, so that, by following the Keynesian framework, so that you will create demand in the economy, and supply would respond to the increase in demand, maybe with a lag. So I think what is important right now is to create a demand in the country, so that the supply will catch up with increase in the additional demand. So this is what we were looking for. This is exactly why many economists have said that there should be an increase of 10% of GDP on the fiscal stimulus. So if that happens, we might overcome the demand constraint in the economy, and we will allow the supply forces to respond to those demand situations.
Yes, indeed. If we talk about agriculture, agriculture employed more than 50% of India's workforce and contributed 17 to 18% to country's GDP. As development takes place in a country, more and more workforce moves towards or moves out of agriculture into the manufacturing sector. With this data, it is evident that more engagement of the Indian workforce is needed in the manufacturing sector. Do you think a stimulus encouraging this movement can result into a significant rise in India's GDP?
See, again, this is going to be a structural issue. Okay.
Yes.
Now, I just wanted to caution here. Now we know, we have been reading that in all the Indian economy textbooks that agriculture sector in India employs more number of people compared to the contribution to GDP. You are right, but I think the number may be slightly lower than 50% if you look at the recent data, which may be good news. But at the same time, one needs to really look at what is this, even if it is 50%, whether they are all employed in the farm activities or they are also employed in the non-farm activities. In my view, I think over a period of time, the non-farm activities would have increased in the rural areas. So that may be absorbing more jobs compared to the farm activity. I think that is the story right now. But when it comes to what you are saying is, we need to shift the production activity from the people from agriculture to manufacturing, industrial sector, and that by doing that you will have a higher GDP. I think that's a very correct assessment of shifting people from agriculture to the industry will have a larger growth impact. I think that's exactly the understanding of the sectoral contribution to the GDP. But at the same time, I also want to caution, this is going to be a long-term objective for the country. Now, if you look at, we already have a medium-term objective in the country where to increase the share of manufacturing sector from 16% right now to 25%. Okay, so if that happens, you will certainly see that you will have more people employed in the manufacturing sector compared to what right now it is employed. So the share of manufacturing sector, if you can increase, certainly you might be able to shift people from agriculture and allied activities towards manufacturing sector, and at the same time you will also see that increase in the labor, the contribution of labor in the GDP growth, and then we will have a slightly higher potential GDP of the country. And I think the mechanism for is that we need to have a structural transformation. I think I want to insist that it's not a simple structural transformation. We should have an expansionary structural transformation. What it means is that if you look at the structure of the GDP growth right now, we have service sector contribution is very high, and next comes the industry and then agriculture sector. But if you look at the employment, I think the agriculture sector absorbs more labor. Then next comes the service sector, and next comes the industrial sector. What we want is, we want to shift the growth from agriculture as well as services towards manufacturing sector, because the employment intensity in the manufacturing sector is much higher than in the service sector.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. So to that extent, if you can increase the share of manufacturing over a period of time, certainly you are going to increase more number of jobs compared to if you are increasing the service sector output. So that is what I've been arguing. I think India needs to focus on expansionary structural transformation, which will absorb more number of jobs in the manufacturing sector, and at the same time, which will increase the GDP growth of this country.
Yes, yes, indeed, indeed. That's a great point, a beautiful point, sir, you have suggested. But how we can take the advantage of COVID, especially after the COVID, what are the important things required to become a manufacturing hub for India?
This is a very big question.
Yes.
It's not a very simple question, so you will not have a simple answer for that. As I told you, I mean, we have been arguing that we should move towards manufacturing sector for a long time. Now, if you look at for the past 10-15 years, the movement towards that particular target is slightly limited. Now, so for that, there are many things that needs to do. I mean, this is what I keep arguing, that if at all you want to increase, if you want to increase the share of manufacturing sector, so you need to open up the sectors for the private sector participation. We have seen that public sector, efficiency of public sector, especially in the industrial sector, is not really great. So to that extent, I think there is a need for measures that will attract more private investment in the manufacturing sector. I think that is the way one should go. So to that direction, now that you have asked me to link to the COVID-19, the recent measures taken by the government of India as part of the Atmanirbhar Bharat are certainly going to create space for the private sector in a big way, because there even a strategic sector like defense and space have been opened up for the private sector. So that means the government or the public sector appears to withdraw from some of the major sectors. So if that happens, we would be able to overcome the present crisis, but also at the same time, in the medium term to long term, we would be able to structurally move upward in the overall growth process.
Yes. Recently, International Energy Agency has released its Global Energy Review 2020 report that says global energy demand is projected to fall 6% in 2020. If the lockdowns are shorter and a rapid recovery happens, the slump in energy demand could be about 3.8% in India, which is still a fairly large figure. What will be its impact on India's already debt-ridden energy infrastructure?
No, if you're looking only at fossil fuel energy, I think yes, there are some issues, but I think in India the mix of energy is a mix of many things. Yes. India is also getting in a big way in the solar energy and all those things. So in any case, I think if you are assessing the whole sector for the medium term to long term, I think 2020 should not be a benchmark. If the 2020 is certainly is going to be a problem. I mean, we have seen the whole world is getting into the recession, and and even India is also going to face a deep recession. So to that extent, if at all you are planning for the long term energy security or energy, if you're talking about the energy sector, I think 2020 should not be part of any kind of discussion in my view. As I told you, like once the policy measures that have been taken recently, if it can increase the structural component of the GDP growth in the medium term to long term, I think our energy demand is also going to increase pro rata basis. So we are going to see a huge energy demand once we are completely out of this COVID-19 as well as the lockdown.
Yes. Indeed, because it means the policymaker should not keep in mind the period that we are experiencing right now. It should think about beyond COVID pandemic.
Yes. That's exactly, and that is exactly what the finance minister also done. If you look at the whole package of Atmanirbhar Bharat, I think the focus on the very short term is very, very limited.
Yes.
So I think
yes.
Yeah, very rightly focused more on the medium term and long term. And I think the medium and long term story of India is
Mm,
certainly intact, and we should be recovering soon, especially when in the by the end of the financial year.
mm. Since you have mentioned that package of 20 lakh crore that was announced by Prime Minister and the Finance Minister, these measures will be effective in the economy with a lag, as you said earlier. Also, it involves no additional public spending, even though this is urgently required to revive the economy right now, because we have to think of the short run. As Keynesian economics or John Maynard Keynes said, in the long run, we are all dead. So, what are your thoughts on it? How long will it take to make a difference, that package of 20 lakh crore?
So, see, my feeling is that I have a mixed feeling in that.
Yes.
There are some measures they should be quickly showing some results. Especially, you have seen the measures like providing liquidity to the MSME sector as well as Kisan credit card and all those things. Now, the going by the recent indicators, I think the banks are really working very hard to really push resources towards MSME sector where you have 100% guarantee from the government of India.
Yes.
But there are other measures. In fact, we have also seen that Prime Minister Garib Kalyan Yojana, again, that has already been done more or less successfully in a sense. It has almost transferred nearly 1 lakh crore under the scheme. That is again the preliminary information that we are getting. So in a sense, there are some measures like agriculture, like you have already seen, the government very quickly worked on bringing out 2 ordinances last week where they can unshackle the whole agriculture sector. Unfortunately, we still treat agriculture as a subsistence kind of a sector in this country, where you need a lot of protectionism and all those. We have to allow the agriculture sector as an industry. I think we need to see agriculture as an industrial activity, not just as a subsistence kind of an agriculture. So to that direction, the recent ordinances that the government of India has brought will help a long way. Of course, there will be some kind of hurdles, especially when you are dealing with the states. But at the same time, in my view, that is the way one should go if at all we have to, respond to the kind of slowdown that we are facing. But at the same, and there are some measures I think in the Atmanirbhar Bharat, like providing liquidity to the market. They are all not really a major policy measures in my view. And that depends on the market forces. I know now the RBI, they say that they have a liquidity measure of 8 lakh crore, but if there is no demand from the corporate sector, I mean, it doesn't work as a stimulus.
Seriously.
So the point is, in fact, they have put conditions on, state government borrowing also, right? They also put conditions, if at all they want to increase the fiscal deficit at the state level more than 3.5%, you should have some kind of satisfy some of the conditions. I think those are the things which might hold the recovery from hold the economy recovering quickly. But at the same time, as I told you, there are some measures that certainly were very important. Okay, so to that extent, I have a mixed feeling. But
Yes.
one thing that I have a problem is, as we rightly pointed out, is that when there is a deficiency in the demand, you need to have policy measures to improve the demand conditions. I think that part has not happened, and that would delay the recovery process in the current year.
Yes, indeed, indeed. Moving towards the disinvestment side, Union Defense Minister recently approved the abolition of some 9,000 posts in the military engineering service. This will lead to significant savings as almost 70% of the budget is used for payment of salaries, allowances, and leaves very little money for actual infrastructural development. According to economists and management experts, overstaffing and corruption are the major factors behind continuing dismal state of public sector enterprises. So do you think this move can be replicated in other public sector enterprises? to benefit India financially?
Well, my view is that I think these kind of moves have already been taken in some public sector enterprises even before.
Yes.
Maybe defense may be one of the last few sectors where this is happening.
Yes.
So it happened in many other sectors, and maybe there are few sectors where it has not really happened. So the rationalization of manpower at public sector enterprises definitely is needed. And in any case, these are all work in progress in that sense. If you look at government offices, we already started long back where many of the jobs have been squeezed. In fact, I guess this may be part of the expenditure management committee recommendations,
Yes.
where proposal is to cut grants or jobs, a number of jobs in the public sector enterprises as well as government office. And I think this has been there for quite some time. But these are all very small things. I mean, if at all you want to bring more very huge impact on the overall sector, I think there is a rethink on the whole disinvestment process. There are some sectors I think the government should be part of it. I think they need to be very clear on that, and I think they should completely withdraw from that particular sector. But on the other hand, there are some strategic sectors. I mean, I may be slightly different. My views may be very different from others. I think when it comes to banking industry, the general consensus seems to be that the public sector banks should be owned off. I think you need to bring down the number of public sector banks to maybe 1 or 2. I think that in my view is a flawed kind of a in the thinking, because the public sector banks, like for example, you have seen in the COVID-19 period, it is the public sector banks which continue to do the service to the people. I mean, and you also seen how the private sector banks get into risky kind of positions. Now there is a recent data that suggests there is a shift in the deposits from private sector banks to public sector banks. The share of public sector banks holding the deposits suddenly increased or become more compared to the private sector banks, especially after the Yes Bank fiasco and other NBFC issues. So given that kind of a situation, I think the people have more faith on the public sector banks relatively compared to the private sector banks. So here we need to have more public sector banks, not less. We need to have strong public sector banks, not weak. But the thinking right now is it's easy. They think that it is easy for government to privatize the public sector banks, but they cannot privatize the services of the public sector bank. Okay, I can give one small indicator. Now we have talked about one of the successful structural reforms in this country is Jan Dhan, Aadhaar and Mobile Trinity, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So now if you look at the Jan Dhan accounts, currently 97% of the Jan Dhan accounts are actually maintained by the public sector banks.
Yes.
It is only 3% or maybe less than 3% of the accounts which is being maintained by the private sector banks. Now, if the thinking is to reduce the public sector banks, number of public sector banks to 2 or 3, then what happens to the financial access or financial inclusion objective of the government, especially for people who are staying in the rural areas or semi-urban area? So I think my feeling is that you need to be careful when you talk about the public sector enterprises or public sector units. There are some where you need to have a larger presence. There are some where you need to have no presence, and there are some areas where you can have a moderate kind of a presence. Yes. I think so. One needs to be differentiating when it comes to the public sector enterprises.
Indeed, and that's a great point. While a sound fiscal policy is highly desirable in the basic economics when we study, the magnitude of the fiscal deficit is not always and everywhere a good measure of soundness and state of economy. whether the fiscal deficit should be the sole index of fiscal management, and whether a reduction in the deficit would achieve significant improvement in detail. What are your thoughts on it?
So I have a completely different opinion on this, and I'm surprised and sometimes pained when a lot of focus is given to the headline fiscal deficit number.
Yes.
Now, even I can understand the rating agencies looking at, or private sector bank analysts, or the foreign companies looking at that, but we have a completely different fiscal statistics. So we have two concepts. One, we have fiscal deficit. Then there is something called revenue deficit.
Yes.
Okay. Now there are two concepts. Now, unfortunately, both in the government as well as in the media as well as rating agencies, they look only at the headline fiscal deficit number, not bothering much on the revenue deficit. Okay.
Yes.
But if you look at the original FRB Act 2003, there are three targets under the original FRB Act. One, it is the fiscal deficit. Second, it is the revenue deficit. And third, there is a public debt.
Yes.
The three targets. Now, conveniently, the government of India has removed revenue deficit as a target in 2018. As part of the finance bill, they have removed the revenue deficit target, and they retained the fiscal deficit as well as the public debt numbers. Now, here is the problem. Now, in the original FRB Act says you have to bring down the revenue deficit to zero, fiscal deficit to 3%, and then only you will see the public debt to GDP ratio coming down to 60%, general government, both center and state. Now, what we have done is, we have done other way around. We have removed the concept of revenue deficit. Now we are bringing the fiscal deficit to 3%, but at the same time, we are actually compressing the capital expenditure.
Yes.
The difference between the fiscal deficit and revenue deficit is capital expenditure. You are actually, the fiscal deficit and revenue deficit is becoming equal. Okay, so in that context, you would not see any positive impact on the growth, rather it will have impact on the inflation. Okay, so any increase in the fiscal deficit, in the absence of this distinction, you will only see that inflation is going up, GDP growth coming down, and the public debt to GDP ratio also will not come down, rather it will increase. Okay, all the three variables are consistent with a GDP growth. Now, if you have four legs, you remove one of the legs. Now you know what happens to that whole table, right? So I think then you will create some kind of a instability in the whole, macro fiscal relationships. So I insist that instead of fiscal deficit, what the government of India should focus is the revenue deficit. So the revenue deficit should be brought down to 0%. I don't bother if the fiscal deficit becomes 3% or 4%. Okay, but I think we need to focus on revenue deficit, and that should be brought down to zero. When I say the viewers also, I think there is some clarity needed here. Yes. Revenue deficit is basically nothing but borrowing for consumption purpose.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Fiscal deficit is a combination of borrowing for consumption purpose and also for the investment purpose.
Yes.
Okay. So when you are doing this, doing away the revenue deficit concept, whatever the fiscal deficit you are running, everything will lead to borrowing for consumption purpose. Now, we don't need to explain. The borrowing for consumption purpose will only lead to demand, and it will only lead to inflation. Rather, it doesn't have any positive impact on the real GDP growth.
Yes, indeed, sir, because there's another concept called primary deficit is also there, where fiscal deficit minus interest payment. And if we see that India's interest payment is having a major share in the fiscal deficit. So if the fiscal deficit is high due to capital investment, that is indeed a great appreciable for the government. But it's like amount of interest payment is very high over the years. That is creating a major. Yes. That was a very insightful discussion with you, sir. And it was a wonderful session with you, very knowledgeable for the students, especially from the public finance perspective and the government of India's fiscal policy perspective. Thank you so much for coming here. at last, we just want some words of encouragement for the team Ecoholics and the students.
Yeah, Sanath, I must tell you, when you contacted me, I immediately felt that I should accept, especially the kind of you're doing. Ecoholics appears to be one go-to platform for people who are preparing for any kind of exams where the economics is part of it, especially I think Indian economic service and all those things. And I have also seen the profile. It's really amazing. Although it's a very young organization, you have been doing great work. And I have seen the staff. I think they're all well qualified, and you got a very good team of people. And also seen you already covered a lot of experts, even people from NITI Aayog as well as Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. So I think the kind of work you have done in the very short period is very, very impressive. I don't have any doubt in my mind that you will be doing much more contributions to the whole profession of economics, maybe from a different angle, where you would be helping people to understand economics well and clear those exams. And also, once they come to the profession, I think they would be doing much better than, and we should expect, with all the kind of inputs that Ecoholics is providing to them, I'm sure they will do a great service to the nation. And indirectly, I think you are going to be part of that whole service to the nation.
Thank you so much, sir, for the wonderful words. We do provide quality economics education for the students so that they understand the difference between relatively fake news and the conceptually wrong news. They understand real economics so that they do better, they do well in future when they become the bureaucrat or the policymaker or the research. Thank you so much, sir, coming on our platform. It's an honor. Thank you.